God is love. This is how Christianity would have us think about God. God is so full of love, they tell us, that he sent his son to die on our behalf. The problem with the statement, God is love, is found in the conquest narrative of the early books of the Bible. Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua tells us about a God who commands Israel to destroy entire cities. Men, women, and children are among those devoted to destruction. There seems to be little to no limit of the destruction God is willing to pour out. Why would a good and loving God, who was willing to sacrifice his son because of his love for the world, allow himself to be described as something akin to a genocidal maniac in the Old Testament? Why does he command Israel to wipe out whole bloodlines in the Exodus and conquest narratives of Pentateuch and Joshua? The Israelites were told to devote whole cities to destruction, including every man, woman, and child. Why? Well, few Christians have good answers to these tough questions, although they are legitimate questions and they're often asked. There are answers. These questions can be answered correctly and I believe convincingly when we understand the supernatural aspects of our Bible. The conquest narratives are not God and his people against all the people of Canaan, and indeed not all the other people. They describe a holy war that pits God against the rebellious gods, the fallen Elohim of Genesis 3, 6, and 11, and their offspring. The answers to these difficult questions are found in a better understanding of the early rebellions, their connections to one another, and their relationship to the conquest in Canaan. We need a better understanding of the background from which a story like the sons of God sleeping with the daughters of men comes from, like the Book of Enoch. We need a better understanding of the Tower narrative and what it communicated to the original audience, as well as a solid grasp of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview as informed by the Tower Rebellion. When we better understand these things, we will see what Dr. Michael Heiser suggests in his book, The Unseen Realm. He writes, the biblical writers deliberately connect the giant clan enemies Israel would face in the conquest back to the ancient apostasies that had Babylon at their root, the sons of God and the Nephilim and the disinheritance of the nations at the Tower of Babel. That concept will help us understand why whole cities and people groups, men, women, and children, were devoted to destruction. They were unholy, neither completely human nor completely divine. The wisdom of Solomon, chapter 12, verse 8, says this about them. But even these you spared as being human. Then verse 10 says, though you were not aware that their origin was evil. And then finally, verse 11 states, for they were an accursed race from the beginning. When verse 8 says that they were spared as being human beings, it means they were spared as if they were human beings, meaning they were not. They were spared only for a time, which I will connect to the 400 years of sojourning from the warning of Genesis 15:16 to Abraham about his descendants. The unholy unions of Genesis 6 and, as I will show later, Genesis 11 are the basis for the sins of the Amorites. These groups were hybrids with evil origins originating from these rebellions, Genesis 3, 6, and 11, especially Genesis 6 and 11. They were offspring from unholy relationships between angels and human women. They were accursed from the beginning. Now, these conquests were not genocidal operations. They were holy wars. The Israelites are not sent to exterminate a fellow human race. They were sent to eradicate an unholy race that will do them in, both physically and spiritually. And not just Israel, but the entire human race if they're not dealt with properly. Genesis 6:5 tells us what happens when the Nephilim, sons of angels who sleep with the daughters of men, are left unchecked. Genesis 6:4 and 5. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of their heart was only evil continually. The book of Enoch provides even more details about what the earth looks like when the sons of God do not maintain their place and their children roam freely. This is from Enoch chapter 7. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. And they began to go in unto them, and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments and the cutting of roots and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisition of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. First Enoch chapter 8 tells us that the fallen watchers, these sons of God, taught men the art of making weapon, the art of seduction, enchantments, potion making, astrology, and more. These sins are what brought on the flood, and they are being repeated in Canaan because of the Nephilim. This is why the giants, the Nephilim, are all associated with, and all those that are associated with them, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Zamzummim, the Elim, and the Amorites, are devoted to destruction. Wisdom, the wisdom of Solomon, describes their sins. This is chapter 12, starting in verse 4 through verse 6. Verse 4b states, deeds of sorcery and unholy rites, merciless slaughterers of children, sacrificing feast on human flesh and blood, those initiates from the midst of pagan ceremony, and parents who murder helpless lives, you willed to destroy by the hands of our fathers. These are the ideas that make the conquest anything but genocide of fellow human races. The conquest was God's tool for dealing with the supernatural rebellion that began in Genesis. The connections between the conquest and the rebellions are made through several means that would have been easily identifiable to the ancient Israelites. Heiser, in his book, The Unseen Realm, makes the connection between the second and third rebellions and the conquest. Dr. Heiser writes, Canaanites and Amorites were therefore generic terms used to describe the enemies of Israel. Of the two, Amorites takes on a more sinister tone in the context of the Babylonian polemic that precedes this point in Israel's story. Tarring and feathering the inhabitants of Canaan with a label that would take an Israelite reader back to supernatural disasters of Genesis 6 and 11 would have a profound theological effect. So Dr. Heiser's quote highlights a common problem with modern readers. Too often, the modern reader wants the Bible to be simple. If he or she has to dig too deep, interest wanes. If the connection between the word Amorites and the supernatural disasters of Genesis 6 and 11 aren't easily made, the modern reader simply keeps moving or eventually gives up altogether. What must be realized, however, is that the information we are forced to dig out was common knowledge among the original audience. Just like saying the word Super Bowl in the West ignites specific images about the National Football League's championship game, saying things like Anakim or Nephilim and Amorite ignites specific images in the minds of the ancient Israelites. The images that would come to mind weren't pretty. God nor Moses needed to explain the Amorites or Nephilim to the Israelites. They didn't need to read countless articles before grasping the concept that the conquest was connected to the original rebels, like I did, or like you may have to. They understand these terms in their context. Heiser continues, he writes, for an Israelite, all this meant that the narrative population of Canaan had a supernaturally sinister point of origin. This wouldn't be just a battle for land. It was a battle between Yahweh and the other gods, gods who had raised up competing human bloodlines that were opposed to Yahweh's plan and people. Now, a passage from Deuteronomy 3:1 through 11 provides ample evidence of the connections that were to be made back to the rebellions of the original audience. The connections Dr. Heiser is referring to in his quote. So I'll highlight the critical points for the sake of space, or only the critical points for the sake of space. First, Og was the king of Bashan, verse 1. And Bashan is a theologically loaded word. Sihon and Og are Amorite kings. That's verse 2 and verse 8. Amorite is also a theologically loaded word. Mount Hermon is mentioned as part of the territory under Og's control. Verse 8. Mount Hermon was the location of the Genesis 6 rebellion, according to First Enoch. It was part of the Bashan mountain range. Now, Og was considered the last of the Rephaim, and this is mentioned in verse 11. Rephaim, like Bashan, is a theologically loaded term. Last, The size of Og's bed is mentioned in a way that provides a clear connection to the idea of Elohim sleeping with the daughters of men. And you can find that in verse 11. And we'll explore all of these a little deeper as we move on. Let's look at Bashan first. Bashan is a theologically loaded word. And so we need to think about what would have come to mind when the original audience and other ancient readers of the conquest narrative heard the word Bashan. The Dictionary of Biblical Languages provides two definitions for the word Bashan, and it's a great starting point for this section. So the first is simply an area east and northeast of the Lake of Galilee. The second, however, is serpent, reptile, snake, or, for example, a limbless scaled reptile, right? The original audience would have considered these things and more when thinking about Bashan and its location. The Israelites would have considered it a real place on the map, so to speak, but it seems likely that the physical location would have been secondary in their minds. First was Bashan's connection to the underworld, to giants, and to the serpent. According to the Dictionary of Deities and Demons, for the Canaanites of Ugarit, the Bashan region, or a part of it, clearly represented hell, the celestial and infernal abode of the deified dead kings, Rephaim. Furthermore, it was known as the abode of the god Milku. Milku was associated with the underworld and worshipped in the kingdom of Ugarit. In the New Testament, Bashan is associated with the gates of hell. You can see Matthew 16 for that. Bashan is associated with giants because it was home to the Amorites, whom Amos 2:9 describes as being as tall as cedars. Sihon and Og are referred to as Amorite kings. Og is also referred to as a Rephaim. The Rephaim were also known as giants. The Rephaim being present in Bashan is also a reference to the underworld through Ugarit, who refers to the Rephaim as deified kings of the underworld. So beyond being associated with the underworld and giants, Bashan is known as the place of the serpent, which would connect what Israel was doing during the conquest to the original garden rebellion of Genesis 3, where the antagonist is described as a serpent. Now, all this considered, as far as the conquest goes, both definitions from the Dictionary of Biblical Languages work. The first is geographically correct. The second is conceptually correct through the connections listed above. Psalm 68:23, it's verse 22 in the Hebrew Bible, is used as a reference for the second definition listed in the Dictionary of Biblical Languages, the serpent definition. Psalm 68:22 says this: "The Lord said, I will bring them back from Bashan. I will bring them back from the depths of the sea." Now, James H. Charlesworth has conducted extensive research on this passage. He concludes, "It now becomes clear that in the biblical Hebrew, Bashan can denote a mythical snake, dragon snake. Now, this idea comes partially from consulting the meaning of the word in Ugarit and referring to the Baal epic where Baal defeats a dragon or serpent. His work has led him to believe a proper rendering of the first phrase in 68:22 is, I will bring them back from the den of the dragon of the snake. Now, this would make the fuller passage read like this. Psalm 68:22 and 23. The Lord spoke, from the den of the dragon snake I will bring them back. I will bring them back from the depths of the sea, so that your foot might crush them in blood, and the tongues of your dogs may have their portion from your enemies. Now, this immediately recalls Genesis 3:15 and the seed crushing the head of the serpent. You see, when we understand the theology packed into the word Bashan, we'll realize precisely what an ancient Israelite would have thought when they read a verse like Psalm 68:22. Bashan was a geographical location in the Transjordan, the place, den of the serpent, home to giants, and the location of the gates of hell or Hades. All of this and more is packed into the word and would be easily recalled by the original audience. We don't need our Bible translators to get on board by translating Bashan as the den of the snake, as Charlesworth suggests. We need only become familiar with the word and allow our minds to take us wherever the author intended us to go. We need to read this verse and others like it in the way an ancient Israelite would have read them. When Israel travels through the Transjordan, heading toward Bashan for holy war, they would have understood it as the place of the serpent, thus connecting it to the first rebellion. They would have known it was the home of the Rephaim, lords of the underworld, and the giant Amorites, connecting it to the second rebellion of Genesis 6. Lastly, they would have made a connection to Babel through the size of Og's bed, which we'll discuss later. But before we do, I want to turn our attention to the term Amorite. So Amorites are directly related to the length of time Israel spent sojourning in Egypt, including their time as slaves there. This idea comes from Genesis 15. So verses 13 through 16 state, "Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." Now, questions arise about the sin of the Amorites. Does this mean their sinful disposition? Does it speak to specific sins, maybe sexual in nature, sexual immorality? And maybe it's referring to a specific sin. Could it mean their willingness to sacrifice children to their gods? Now, I mentioned the wisdom of Solomon above and the sins listed there. It assumes there's a multitude of sins on the author's mind. I agree, but I take a bit of a different approach. The specific sin is the sin of the second rebellion. Women were sleeping with the sons of God, creating races of Nephilim. The sin leads to all the other races of Nephilim, and to the sins mentioned in the wisdom of Solomon. The underlying cause, however, is their willingness to go after the sons of God. And we have an example. In Genesis 19, two angels visit Sodom to warn Lot of the impending judgment. When the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. Every person in Sodom had come for the angels, asking, "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" They said, "Bring them out to us that we may know them." Now, we may try to blame their behavior on lasciviousness, right? But there are details in the story that suggest otherwise. For example, Lot has two virgin daughters. They've somehow existed in the city without being raped by a mob their entire time in Sodom. There's also no indication that Lot has ever experienced such a threat. The implication then is that this is not mere lasciviousness, but something more. The sin of Sodom is that of going after strange flesh. We have this from Jude, verses 6 through 8. "And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. As Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Likewise, also these dreamers defile the flesh, reject authority, and speak evil of dignitaries." Now notice the context Jude gives us. It's the sin of the angels who did not keep their proper domain. This is an obvious reference to the sons of God in Genesis 6. The men of Sodom went after strange flesh, following the example set by the fallen sons of God in Genesis 6. To put the reference to the sin of the sons of God over the top, Jude quotes the Book of Enoch. The specific quotation is chapter 1, verse 9, and he does this in verses 14 and 15. The sin of the Amorites, which was not yet full in Genesis 15 and 16, is the sin of the second rebellion. We know this because the Amorites are giants, as mentioned above. Amos 2:9. "Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and who was as strong as the oaks. I destroyed his fruit above, and his roots beneath." This verse makes my immediate point and a point about the purpose of the conquest. First, the Amorites are giants. When the Israelites hear they will face the Amorites, they hear they will face giants. And there's an immediate connection to their thoughts concerning the second rebellion. Giants are born from unholy unions between human women and the sons of God. On another level, we see that God was not trying to destroy human lines, but the lines of the fallen sons of God. God destroyed his fruit above and his roots beneath, meaning the Amorites. The point of the conquest was to remove the unholy fruit of these unnatural unions and the roots producing them. That is, the giants, the fruit, along with the people who approved of and participated in these unions and their gods, the roots. The mention of Mount Hermon strengthens the above argument as well. Mount Hermon is part of the Bashan mountain range. It is within the place of the snake, but its connection to the second rebellion is much stronger than being a part of the Bashan area. Mount Hermon is the specific mountain listed in 1 Enoch as the place where the second rebellion begins. Mount Hermon is where the watchers agreed by oath to take for themselves wives. Enoch 6:6. And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. So Mount Hermon is the place where the second rebellion is laid out and agreed upon by the sons of God who have determined to sin against the proper place and order. When the Israelites hear that they are going to Bashan, the home of Amorite kings, one of which is the king at Mount Hermon, the connections are crystal clear. Their task is certain. God is commissioning us to cleanse the earth of the unholy line that was never meant to exist, a line meant to compete with Yahweh and his people. Now, the term Rephaim is no less loaded with theological meaning than any of the terms that have gone before it. Dr. Heiser, in his article in the Lexham Bible Dictionary, writes this about the Rephaim. Rephaim is a Hebrew word often simply transliterated in modern English versions. When the term is translated, it is rendered giants, shades, or simply the dead. These translation choices point to the interpretive problem associated with the term. It is difficult to identify whether the Rephaim were humans, living or dead, quasi-divine figures, or disembodied spirits. Now, the Tyndale Bible Dictionary defines them first as shades. Rephaim is a Hebrew word referring to shades or departed spirits whose dwelling place was the habitation of Sheol. Their immaterial being bore a weakened shadow-like resemblance to their former corporality. Now, it goes on to define them as a mighty people, tall in stature, and describes them as being comparable in size and number to the giant Anakim. The Anakim giants were present in Jericho when 10 of the 12 spies delivered a negative report, which led to the 40 years of wandering. Deuteronomy 2:10 connects the Anakim to the Rephaim in describing a clan of giants called the Amim, whom the Moabites had defeated earlier. A few verses later, we are introduced to another group of Rephaim known as the Zamzummim. They were defeated by the Amorites, descendants of Lot. Now, at the very least, when the Israelites are on their way to rid the Transjordan of its last Rephaim, they know they are going to expel giants, a clear connection to the second rebellion. What more they would have thought about the Rephaim is unclear, but the possibilities are pretty vast. The biblical text also recalls that all Bashan used to be called the land, earth of the Rephaim. Now, I've already made mention that Bashan is the place of the serpent, which connects the Rephaim to the first rebellion. They lived in and ruled over the place of the serpent. Furthermore, the area of Bashan is known as the abode of the god Milku, who is considered the god of the underworld. Now, this recalls what wisdom says about the original inhabitants of the promised land. You can see Wisdom of Solomon chapter 12 for that. Now, concerning Bashan being the land of the Rephaim, the Dictionary of Deities and Demons says it's an ambiguous word that could equally be translated as the hell of the Rephaim. This is an interesting connection to the first rebellion, since some connect the serpent's curse to eat the dust to a promise of being placed in the underworld. The Faith Life Study Bible states, ancient Near Eastern texts, such as the Akkadian work Descent of Ishtar, depict serpents as inhabitants of the underworld that feed on dust and clay. This connection is strengthened when we consider that the area of Bashan was known to house gateways to the underworld, one of which Jesus visited in Matthew 16. In Caesarea Philippi, Jesus tells his disciples, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That's Matthew 16, verse 18. We don't think much of it, but Jesus was standing in front of a gateway to hell. It was called the Cave of Pan when he proclaimed his coming assault upon it. Now, is this how the Israelites would have thought about Bashan? It's likely, but if not the group of Moses, then these concepts unquestionably come to mind when the later Israelites hear the stories. But I would argue that it's definitely true of the Israelites with Moses as well. Now, I want to address the strongest connection to the third rebellion. That's the size of Og's bed. A brief and initial examination of available data about Og's bed reveals a connection to his great size. Several YouTube videos I watched do the same. Og's bed points to Og's size. However, if we leave it at that, we'll miss the most crucial connection the mention of Og's bed is meant to make. It connects the earliest stage of the conquest to Babel, the third rebellion in Babel. Furthermore, it connects the conquest to the second rebellion concerning the sons of God sleeping with the daughters of men. This connection is made on several levels. First, towers or temples. And that is how we should approach the Babel event in Genesis 11. Dr. John Walton believes the sin of Genesis 11 is not their failure to spread out according to the original mandate, but building a temple. So Genesis 11:4 states, "Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.'" About this verse, Dr. Walton writes, "One single architectural feature dominated the landscape of early Mesopotamian cities, towers known as ziggurats. In the earliest stages of urbanization, the city was not designed for the private sector. People did not live in the city. Instead, it was comprised of the public buildings, such as administrative buildings and granaries, which were mostly connected with the temple. Consequently, the city was, in effect, a temple complex." Dr. Walton goes on to say, "Throughout Mesopotamian literature, almost every occurrence of the expression describing a building with its head in the heavens refers to a temple with a ziggurat. It is this language, along with the indication that God came down, that gives textual confirmation that the tower is a ziggurat. This would have been transparent to the ancient reader. So in light of the above comments, it's easy to accept the tower as a temple complex, a ziggurat, rather than a tower to escape future floods, as some of us were taught as children. Now, Walton goes on to describe ancient ziggurats. He says, "Though they may resemble pyramids in appearance, ziggurats are nothing like them in function. Ziggurats have no inside. The structure was framed in mud brick, and then the core was packed with fill dirt. The facade was then completed with kiln-fired brick. Ziggurats were dedicated to particular deities. Any given deity may have several ziggurats dedicated to him or her in different cities. Furthermore, a given city may have several ziggurats, though the main one was associated with the patron deity of the city. Archaeologists have discovered nearly 30 ziggurats in the general region, and texts mention several others. The main architectural feature is the stairway or ramp that leads to the top. There was a small room at the top where a bed was made and a table set for the deity. Now, of interest to our current study is the room at the top of the ziggurat meant to house the deity. It was complete with a bed. Before we get there, I would like to address the phrase from Genesis 11:4 that says, "Let us make a name for ourselves." Walton doesn't make the following connection as far as I can tell, but I see in the phrase a direct connection to the conquest and its purpose of eliminating the Nephilim and their descendants. In Deuteronomy 7:22 through 26, we read, "The Lord your God will clear away these nations before you little by little. You may not make an end of them at once, lest the wild beasts grow too numerous for you. But the Lord your God will give them over to you and throw them into great confusion until they are destroyed. And he will give their kings into your hand, and you shall make their name perish from under heaven. No one shall be able to stand against you until you have destroyed them. The carved images of their gods you shall burn with fire. You shall not covet the silver or the gold that is on them, or take it for yourselves, lest you be ensnared by it. For it is an abomination to the Lord your God. And you shall not bring an abominable thing into your house and become devoted to destruction like it. You shall utterly detest and abhor it. for it is devoted for destruction. Now, a much larger section of this passage would be worthy of our time, but I can't just place it here due to space. But in the passage I provided, Moses is instructing Israel to take the land from its inhabitants. God promises to give the Canaanite kings into their hands, saying, "And you shall make their name perish from under heaven." This is connected to Genesis 11, I believe directly connected. The name they hope to establish is wiped out in the conquest and under King David. The point of the tower was to invite the gods to return and create for them an eternal heritage through divine sons. This is precisely what the conquest is meant to reverse. Now, there's a particular detail mentioned in Deuteronomy 3 that I find interesting in connection with the idea that ziggurats had a resting place at their tops, furnished with a bed. It's the size of Og's bed. Perhaps the most famous of all ziggurats is the ancient Sumerian ziggurat known as Etemenanki. It was built for the god Marduk. Interestingly, we know the size of the bed that was in the resting place at the top. Now, Etemenanki is the name of a ziggurat in Babylon, believed by some to be the tower mentioned in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. Its remains have long been looted for other building projects, but its location is marked by a pit as deep as the tower is believed to have been high. The third edition of the New Bible Dictionary describes the ziggurat as having 6 levels, crowned by a 7th, which was a temple. Now it says, the whole was crowned by a temple where the god was thought to descend for intercourse with mankind. Now, this idea is mentioned by the Greek historian Herodotus. He says, "And in the last tower there is a large cell, and in that cell there is a large bed, well covered, and a golden table is placed near it. And there is no image set up there, nor does any human being spend the night there, except only one woman of the natives of the place, whomever the god shall choose from all the women, as the Chaldeans say, who are the priests of this god. These same men also say, but I do not believe them, that the god himself comes often to the cell and rests upon the bed, just as it happens in the Egyptian Thebes, according to the report of the Egyptians. For there also a woman sleeps in the temple of the Theban Zeus, and both these women are said to abstain from contact with men. And as happens also with the prophetess of the god in Patara and Lycia, whenever there is one, for there is not always an oracle there. But whenever there is one, then she is shut up during the nights in the temple within the cell." It is the bed from Marduk's chamber, the god of Babylon, that I believe is the reference for the biblical account of Og's bed, providing a connection to the third rebellion through the Tower of Babel from Genesis 11, Etemenanki. In the ancient world, royal beds were considered battle trophies. When a city was conquered, the bed of the defeated king would be paraded through the streets of the conquered city as a demonstration of the defeated king's loss of status and political sovereignty. Now, Maria Lindquist writes the following. She says, "Along with proudly recounting their subjugation of foreign peoples, Assyrian rulers were fond of cataloging the booty seized in the course of their exploits. As in Deuteronomy 3:7, Neo-Assyrian military records often mention cattle among the spoils of war. Other plunder are precious metals, human slaves, jewelry, weapons, and furniture, in particular, beds." Now, Lindquist goes on to describe the fall of Babylon to the Assyrian king Sennacherib in 689 BC, and that Marduk's bed was taken from the temple. It was housed in Assyria in the temple of Assur, a demeaning gesture that would signal Marduk's demotion. This was the exact message, if you think about the Philistines, who this is the message they conveyed when they captured the ark and placed it in the temple of Dagon. You can read about that in 1 Samuel 4. Now later, Assyria's power waned, and Babylon grew strong. In an attempt to forego rebellion, Ashurbanipal, Sennacherib's successor, returned the bed in 654 BC. Now his attempt failed. Babylon revolted just 2 years later. But this is relevant because Ashurbanipal recorded the event in 2 separate annals. He also set up a stone inscription commemorating the event in Assur's temple and displayed 3 copies of it in the temple of Ishtar in Nineveh. Now, this is what Lindquist writes about it. Marduk's bed is also described in Babylonian records, such as the Esagil tablet, which notes the measurement of the bed kept in Marduk's shrine. The bed, 9 cubits its long side, 4 cubits its front. These figures are compelling since they match the dimensions given for Og's bed in Deuteronomy 3:11, and it's possible that the author of Deuteronomy may have been specifically alluding to the bed in Marduk in this verse, especially considering the highly publicized position of the bed in 7th century international politics. In the size of Og's bed, we see a connection between the early stages of the conquest and the second and third rebellions from Genesis 6 and 11. The gods were known to desire human women, and ziggurats were designed to accommodate that desire. Now, in conclusion, when we understand that the conquest of Canaan is connected to the 3 rebellions described in Genesis, we can maintain the Christian idea that God is love, connecting the conquest to the serpent's rebellion in chapter 3, the fall of the sons of God in chapter 6, and the Babel event of chapter 11 helps us see something other than genocide and the command to devote to destruction entire cities and their population. Through connections found in theologically loaded terms from Deuteronomy 3, such as Bashan, Amorites, Mount Hermon, and Rephaim, we see that God was ridding Canaan of the same harm that caused creation to cry out against the sins of the Nephilim and caused the intentions of men's hearts to be continually evil. Bashan connects the first rebellion through its conceptual connection to the serpent. Bashan is known as the place of the serpent. The term Amorites describes giants and is therefore directly related to the second rebellion. Giants are the offspring of unholy unions between the sons of God and the daughters of men. King Og, an Amorite king, is the king of Mount Hermon, the place where the second rebellion was planned and agreed upon by the fallen sons of God. The Rephaim are also giants, strengthening the connection to the second rebellion. They are also considered shades, the lords of the underworld. Their presence in Bashan makes sense considering that Bashan is the abode of the god Milku, god of the underworld. Bashan is known to have access to the underworld. The gates of hell are described as being in Bashan via Caesarea Philippi in Matthew chapter 16. Now, an exclamation point is added to all of this by way of the description of Og's bed. Its size connects King Og directly to the Babel event. His bed matches the exact dimensions of Marduk's bed, which was once housed in the ziggurat, likely described in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel event. Now, with these points of connection, we see the God of Israel ridding the world of a great evil perpetrated on mankind by fallen Elohim. The narrative does not picture God indiscriminately wiping out entire races of people, but rather eliminating unholy races of beings that were never meant to be, evil in origin that threatened all of creation like they did before the flood. The sin of the Amorites, if left unchecked, would bring judgment on the whole earth, something far worse than anything described during the conquest. Can we as believers in the God of the Bible maintain that God is love? Yes. The conquest narrative does not describe a genocidal maniac bent on ridding the world of other races. Instead, the conquest narrative describes a God against fallen members of his household who have rebelled against the good order he set in place. The God of the Bible is love, and he will go to war to protect his people and the creation he blessed them with.